Today because with COVID, I sat down and actually wrote the book that I've been saying for the past 30 years that I was going to write. I noticed long ago that a lot of the emotional and even technical things involved with providing care for people during childbirth were really very similar and parallel to the care that I was giving doing palliative care. It's a very different part of life, but these are very unique and also universal parts of everybody's life. And I had the joy and the privilege of being able to walk alongside people as they were experiencing these things and hopefully helping along the way. Now, you most likely have heard of my father, Murray Ankin, and you most likely heard about his interest in death and dying, as well as his profound interest and influence in childbirth and family-centered maternity care. You may not know that he coined the term Tokothanatology, which is what I use as part of the title of my book. The book title is Bookends: A Family Doctor Explores Birth, Death, and Tokothanatology. Now, you won't find that word in any dictionary yet, but I thought of the idea, I think it was my idea to begin with, and he coined the term. Now, in our family, we have a long history of making up words. On their honeymoon, Marie and Eleanor created the word drucine to describe that beautiful color after sunset and before dark. As kids, we used to say, I don't love you, I pub you. And the act of stirring up ice cream, especially that Neapolitan chocolate, vanilla, strawberry mixture, we would stir up and that became pinking. It made a soupy, pink, delicious mess. So when I started writing this book, my dad was 95, sorry. And it was a topic that was near and dear to his heart. And I asked him if he would write a foreword, which he left little notes to himself all over and thought that he would write. And we actually found part of one a year after he died in the computer. And so it's actually in the book. But when I thought, okay, I'm not going to get him to write anything, I asked him if he would tell me where this definition of the word Tokothanatology came. So I had a short definition that is on the back of the book, but this is what he wrote to me. I came up with the neologism myself. The derivation is pretty obvious. Tokology, is the science of birth and should be in most good dictionaries. Thanatology is a well-accepted term for the science of death. If you want to talk or write about birth and death in the same sense, a transition from a non-existential living entity to a no longer living entity, the best way in my picture is to use the concept of sets, with birth being the entry into the set of living organism and death the exit. If you want to talk about both, Tokothanatology seems like a good word. Now, of course, I'm more interested in death than in birth, and the death I am interested in is my own. Eleanor had, I think, a good death, although, of course, we don't know how she perceived it. And as always, I saw a parallel at the other end of life, at the beginning of life. In about 2010, a birth advocate named Suzanne Arms did an interview of my father, and she asked him questions about what he remembered. And one of the things that he thought about was Nomi's birth. Nomi is my younger sister, the second of the four of us. She can't be here today because she's sick. As the only doctor in a small town, he said, he delivered his own daughter. I think of birth as what it was with Nomi. First of all, she was my daughter, and she slithered into my arms, and it was so beautiful, just nice. I enjoyed it, and I think she enjoyed it. She cried, but I still think she enjoyed it. a beautiful experience. It certainly was for me, and she says it was for her. My own definition of tokology, because I was using that as the title, and actually the publisher said, I don't know if I would use a word that doesn't really exist, but I thought I would. And I made sure that the definition was on the back. So I called it a theoretical study of the parallels between birth, death, and especially in medical care. So my own life's work really was Tokothanatology. I did a full general practice, as I said, but the things that I was most interested in were delivering babies, taking care of pregnant women, young babies, and later on, as my patients were getting older, taking care of them through their terminal illnesses, at their death, and also supporting their families after. I felt the miracle every baby that I delivered, and I felt the emotional impact of every death as I saw their last breaths. And I saw especially how their families, and I mean this in the broad sense of the word, the people that are important to them, changed with each of these events. Birth changes everything, death changes everything. The birth of a child means couples become parents, parents become grandparents, a child becomes big sister. And in a terminal illness, an adult child might become a caregiver, people become the primary wage earners, everything in their lives change. And this is absolutely universal. The more I thought about it, the more I saw other parallels of these these bookends of life. So looking back 100, 150 years ago, birth was something that was not even a medical event. It was part of a woman's life. And it was usually supported at home, usually by a sister or a midwife. And it was just part of the family. It was painful. There were often a lot of deaths. There were disabilities, but it was also a joyful event and a part of everybody's life. But there were a lot of problems. And as science came in, we learned how to control pain. We learned how to control infection. We learned how to monitor babies, and we became much more medicalized. Births moved into hospitals, especially in North America, but in Europe and other places as well. We became very technical. We had a lot of evidence. And later on in the 1960s and 1970s, and even before that, really, there was a pushback and said, look, this is our bodies, this is our pregnancies, and we want some control in it. And we want to have education. So we took on the role of childbirth without fear. We learned that education around what was happening would reduce pain, would make things better. We learned about Lamaze breathing and things like that. And both of my parents were very involved with that, bringing it in a lot of ways to North America with some other very famous people. So I grew up learning that. And at the same time that that was going on, and again, my father and mother were very involved with this, we looked hard at the evidence of some of the technology of what we were doing. And we didn't want to get rid of the good parts of that, but we wanted to balance it. So parallel that, think about dying. 150 years ago, dying was part of family life. It happened at home. We really didn't have very much to offer people. People died in childbirth, people died of accidents, people died of infections. And the families were there and the caregivers. Medical science didn't have very much to offer. They could hold a hand, they could offer laudanum, which was kind of a precursor of the narcotics that we use today. But if somebody was ill, you kind of knew they were going to die. And then science developed all kinds of wonderful things. Again, infection control, surgical techniques, cancer treatments, heart treatments, resuscitation. And so it became very technical. Death moved from the home into the hospital, from the hospital bed into ICUs, which are intensive care units, because we could put tubes in every orifice and we could monitor absolutely every person as they lay dying. And death became actually a failure of technology. While the families sat in the waiting room and got to see their loved ones with the flashing lights and the tubes for about 5 minutes every hour, if that. And they didn't see their loved ones, they didn't take part in the deaths. And so they lost out on part of that journey. And again, around the same times in the mid last century, there was a pushback, and there were people that said, we want to have our own lives back. We want to have our deaths back. And we want to have the more human, patient-oriented or family-oriented experience at the end of life, just like we have at birth. But we don't want to throw the baby out with the bath water, which is a really bad analogy, but it's what keeps coming out. My editor, who happens to be my sister Jane, wouldn't let me put it in the book. But I was reading last night, as one is wont to do. You can't sleep in the middle of the night because you're going to be in front of a microphone the next day. And this book, which I think was also launched here, which is Enjoying the Interval, Murray Aitken, A Life. So what I read last night was an excerpt from a talk he gave to the World Health Organization. And I'm just going to read it out because it just really resonated with me. This is a quote of Murray Aitken. By art of care, I mean those essential but unmeasurable components of care that count, even though they cannot be counted. The empathy and judgment that individualizes and personalizes care for each woman and family. By the science of care, I refer to the extent to which care is based on evidence that is effective, that it achieves the desired effect. Both art and science are essential components of care. And I thought it was my idea. So we want to have personal choice. We realize that with family-centered maternity care, natural childbirth, Lamaze type childbirth, and we also realize that at the end of life. One of the other things that I noticed is that it's very important for people to tell the story. You know that women always want to tell about their deliveries and share their horror stories. So pregnant women always hear about all of those things, but even afterwards, and Lynn Johnson did a wonderful cartoon about thinking about who she could call. When people are dealing with the loss of a loved one, they also want to tell the story. People need to tell the story over and over again because that helps them with the reality. I'm sure some of you heard, we certainly did many, many times, my father's words about my mother Eleanor's final hours. I kissed her with each breath, and when there were no more breaths, I kissed her again. And there's a story that we heard many times from my mother, just to show that things happen at both ends of life. My mother often told the story about her second pregnancy. She described the overwhelming feeling of love she had felt for her firstborn, that was me, as soon as the baby was born, and how the love grew as time went on. Pregnant with her second child, she felt a bit of sadness for this new baby growing within her, as she thought she could not possibly feel the same strong love that she had felt for the first child. As soon as my sister arrived, my mother realized that love increases exponentially, and she had as much love for her second baby as she had for her first. A sense of relief, along with love, made the emotional connection even stronger. My mother said she felt the surge of love repeated itself with each of her babies, and I know she felt it completely for all four of us her whole life. So as I decided this was going to be not an article and a whole book, I decided to look at some of the other aspects of parallels at both ends of life. There are prayers that people say around death, of course, and support for the loved one, the prayer for a passage to the next life. But there are also prayers that are said for and by a woman in labor and for a new baby in almost every religion. There's a sense of a circle of life that is fundamental to all spiritual beliefs. There are gatherings, there are showers for babies, there are funerals, there are sitting Shiva. There are little things like taking a lock of hair of a newborn baby. There's a Muslim technique at a certain point of shaving a baby's head and weighing that and giving as a charitable donation that amount of silver. There are noises that women make during labor. And in the final stages, we hear Cheyne-Stokes breathing and end-of-life breathing, and we hear different things at both ends of life. In fact, a nurse that is taking care of a woman in labor can be outside of the room, and as she hears her breathing change, she knows when she has to jump up and be there because she's going to start pushing. And the same is true at the end of life. So there are choices at both ends of life on how we deal with things, how we look at the extent of care. We don't just catch a baby and leave. We take care of the woman before, we take care of the family after. When a person dies, we take care of them in their final days, and we support the families after the death as well. I also looked at a lot of the ethical issues, and we can certainly talk about those in greater depth if you like. There's the ethical conundrums, there's abortion, there's MAID, there's the idea of choice. My husband died with medical assistance in dying, and he was pretty definite that that's what he wanted. He had terrible ALS, he was unable to move, but on the morning that he had chosen to die, he asked me, am I doing the right thing? And it occurred to me that when we started having birth control pills and we could allow the choice of when to start families, in some ways it made the choice more difficult. Instead of, well, you just get pregnant or not. At the end of life, we now have given people an extra choice of, do I want to choose when I'm going to die? Or am I just going to let it happen when it does? So where we can add things, we also have to be cognizant of the fact that we make things more difficult, and we have to look at those. So the incidence of death in all of these individuals that I have learned, and all of the other individuals in the world, is 100%. We all were born, we all die. We all are touched by new lives coming in. We all are touched by lives leaving us. And that is Tokothanatology. That is the bookends of life. So I brought a few copies of my book. They are for sale. If anybody's interested, please do not feel compelled to buy them. They're available other ways too. I'm looking forward to discussion, and I thank you for your time.